Fiona Carrington had built her career on sharp wit, relentless critiques, and an unapologetic progressive stance that made her one of the most polarizing yet widely watched late-night hosts in the country. Her show, The Late Night Spotlight, was a platform where no guest was spared from her biting sarcasm, whether they were politicians, celebrities, or cultural icons. She thrived on confrontation, on tearing down outdated ideologies, and on delivering the kind of scathing commentary that her audience adored. Every night, millions tuned in, eager to see her dissect and dismantle her guests, with well-timed quips and razor-sharp comebacks. It was during one of her production meetings that her team floated the idea of inviting Clint Eastwood to the show. The room immediately buzzed with a mix of excitement and skepticism. Clint was a legend, an actor and director whose name was synonymous with Hollywood's golden age, but he was also a figure of controversy. His rugged masculinity and old-school values had made him a cinematic icon, but his outspoken conservative views had often put him at odds with the modern cultural climate. He was admired by many, ridiculed by others, and Fiona knew that having him on her show would be a goldmine for ratings. She leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen against the table, a slow smirk spreading across her face. This wasn't just an opportunity for a great interview. It was a chance to put a relic of the past on display, to expose what she saw as the outdated ideals, personified by the man himself. Fiona never approached an interview unprepared, and for this one, she was determined to be more than ready. Over the following days, she buried herself in research, watching hours of Clint's movies, scouring his interviews, and taking meticulous notes. His rise to fame, his roles in the Man with No Name trilogy, his transition into directing, and his political statements, all of it was fair game. She jotted down sharp one-liners, prepared clever juxtapositions between his past and the modern world, and carefully crafted her approach. She imagined the roaring laughter of her audience as she delivered her opening monologue, picking apart Clint's past characters and linking them to his real-world persona. He was the symbol of an era where men solved their problems with guns and silence, an era where women had been relegated to the background. She could already see the headlines. Fiona Carrington schools Clint Eastwood on the modern world. It was perfect. The anticipation for the episode grew, and her producers knew they had something special on their hands. "This is going to be legendary," Fiona mused to her head writer, Veronica, who nodded in agreement. "It'll be a ratings hit for sure," Veronica replied. "Just remember to keep it playful. Don't give him too much room to respond." Fiona chuckled as she adjusted her microphone. "He's 94 years old. He's not going to keep up with me." Meanwhile, miles away at his ranch in Carmel, California, Clint Eastwood sat in his sunlit kitchen, a cup of black coffee in one hand and Fiona's invitation in the other. The world outside his window was quiet, the rolling hills stretching endlessly, a stark contrast to the noise of the media circus that awaited him if he accepted. Across the table, his assistant, Jack, shifted uneasily, watching Clint's expression carefully. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Jack asked hesitantly. "Fiona Carrington isn't exactly friendly territory." Clint gave a faint smile, his weathered face betraying neither irritation nor apprehension. "Friendly or not, a conversation's a conversation," he said simply. "People can say what they want. It doesn't change the truth." Jack wasn't convinced. He had seen enough of Fiona's interviews to know how ruthless she could be. "She's going to come after you. She'll bring up politics, your movies, probably even your age." Clint shrugged. "Let her." He set the letter down on the table and gazed out the window. "Sometimes it's not about winning or losing. It's about showing up." The days leading up to the interview were a stark contrast between the two camps. While Fiona and her team meticulously planned every angle of attack, Clint remained unfazed. He went about his routine as if nothing out of the ordinary was on the horizon, refusing to rehearse or strategize his responses. "Aren't you at least going to prepare?" Jack asked, exasperated, as they drove to the airport. Clint shook his head. "No need," he replied. "I'll say what I have to say," Jack sighed, gripping the steering wheel. "I just don't want to see you get ambushed." Clint chuckled. "Jack, I've been in this business longer than she's been alive. A few jokes won't break me." When the day of the show arrived, the energy in the studio was electric. The live audience filled the seats, a mix of regular fans and curious onlookers eager to witness the spectacle. The late-night spotlight set gleamed under the studio lights, the backdrop of the city's skyline framing the scene, and Fiona's name flashing boldly on the screens. Backstage, she rehearsed her opening lines, perfecting the delivery, relishing the impact they would have. Tonight was going to be something special. She could feel it. Meanwhile, in the green room, Clint sat calmly, sipping water, watching the monitor as the opening sequence played. Jack fidgeted nervously beside him. "Look at that crowd," Jack muttered, shaking his head. "They're eating out of her hand already." Clint glanced at the screen, observing Fiona as she stepped onto the stage with her signature confidence. "That's her job," he said simply, leaning back in his chair. "Mine's to tell the truth. Let's see what happens." Fiona launched into her monologue, her energy high and her delivery impeccable. She started with lighthearted jokes before pivoting to the guest of the night. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced with mock grandeur, "we've got a legend in the house tonight. A true Hollywood icon. A man who still thinks talking to an empty chair is good entertainment. Clint Eastwood." The audience erupted in laughter, some cheering, others clapping in agreement. Fiona grinned, pleased with the reaction. She continued, taking jabs at his movies, his politics, and his age, each punchline landing as the crowd roared. Backstage, Clint watched with mild amusement, his expression unreadable. Jack, however, was visibly uncomfortable. "She's laying it on thick," Jack muttered. Clint nodded slightly. "She's doing her job. Let her have her fun." When Fiona finally introduced Clint, the applause was mixed. Some cheers, some scattered boos. She extended her hand as he walked onto the stage, and Clint shook it firmly, his face calm and composed. He tipped his hat slightly to the audience, earning a few unexpected laughs and polite claps. Fiona leaned in, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. "Mr. Eastwood, welcome to the show," she said, her tone light, but with an unmistakable edge of mockery. Clint smiled faintly. "Thanks for having me," he replied, his voice steady. "Nice crowd you've got here." The tension in the room was almost tangible as Fiona leaned forward, hands clasped, ready to begin her verbal sparring. "Oh, they're great," she said smoothly. "They love a good debate. Ready to dive in?" Clint tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady, unreadable. "Always," he said. And with that, the stage was set. The curtain on their duel had officially been raised. Fiona was ready to dominate. Clint remained calm, knowing he had nothing to prove. The battle of perspectives was about to begin, but neither of them could have anticipated just how much the night would change them both. Clint Eastwood had never been the kind of man who shied away from a challenge, nor was he the type to engage in unnecessary battles. At 94, he had seen enough of the world to know that most arguments weren't about truth, but about performance, about people trying to score points rather than actually listening. That was why, when the invitation from the late-night spotlight arrived, he had simply tilted his head, read it over once, and set it down beside his morning coffee. His assistant, Jack, had more to say about it, shifting uncomfortably as he stood near the kitchen counter, arms crossed, his face etched with concern. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Jack asked, his voice careful, measured. Clint looked up from his coffee, arching a brow. "Why wouldn't I?" Jack exhaled. "Come on, Clint. You know Fiona Carrington isn't exactly friendly territory. She's made a career out of tearing people apart, especially people with views like yours." Clint didn't react, his expression unreadable as he reached for his coffee mug and took a slow sip. "People can say what they want," he said finally. "Doesn't change the truth." Jack ran a hand through his hair, clearly unconvinced. "You know how these shows work. It's not about having a real conversation. It's about entertainment. Fiona's audience is expecting her to go after you. They're going to cheer when she mocks you. They're going to laugh when she makes you look outdated. And she will try—" Clint's lips curled slightly, not quite a smile, but something close to amusement. "She's got a job to do," he said simply, "and I've got mine." Jack shook his head, pacing slightly as he thought through his next words. "Clint, she's going to hit you on politics, your movies, probably even your age." Clint finally set his mug down, leaning back in his chair, his gaze shifting toward the sun-drenched fields outside his window. "Let her," he said. "A conversation's a conversation." Jack let out a sigh, exasperated. "You're not worried about them twisting your words?" Clint chuckled, shaking his head. "Jack, I've been in this business longer than she's been alive. People will hear what they want to hear. My job isn't to convince them otherwise. My job is to tell the truth. Jack studied him for a long moment, his concern evident. Clint was a legend, but he was also a target. He had built a career on his own terms, refusing to be molded by Hollywood's expectations, and that had earned him both deep admiration and sharp criticism. But Fiona Carrington wasn't just another critic. She was one of the best in the game when it came to tearing people down with humor and precision. Jack knew that walking onto her show was like stepping into a lion's den, but Clint didn't seem remotely fazed. Sometimes, Clint added after a pause, it's not about winning or losing, it's about showing up. Jack wasn't sure how to argue with that, but as the days ticked down to the interview, his nerves only grew. Meanwhile, Clint went about his routine as if nothing was different. He spent his mornings walking the ranch, his afternoons working in his home studio, and his evenings enjoying the quiet that came with a life well lived. He didn't watch Fiona's previous interviews. He didn't read articles about how she dismantled her guests. He didn't rehearse answers or come up with witty retorts. He simply carried on as usual. That was the difference between him and people like Fiona, Jack realized. She lived for the performance, for the sharpness of the exchange, for the control of the conversation. Clint, on the other hand, didn't see this as a performance. He saw it as just another conversation, no more important than the ones he had at the local diner or with the ranch hands who worked his land. That kind of confidence, the quiet, unshakable kind, was something that couldn't be faked. On the day of the interview, Clint arrived at the studio without fanfare. While Fiona was backstage reviewing her notes, rehearsing her jokes, and preparing to control the narrative, Clint simply strolled into the green room, nodded at the crew members, and settled into a chair with a bottle of water. He wasn't dressed for theatrics, no expensive suit, no carefully curated look, just a well-tailored blazer, a simple shirt, and jeans. He looked exactly as he always did, a man comfortable in his own skin, unbothered by the noise around him. Jack, on the other hand, was anything but calm. He stood near the monitor watching as the audience filtered in, their energy electric. "Look at that crowd," he muttered. "They're eating out of her hand already." Clint glanced at the screen, watching Fiona step onto the stage, her confidence radiating as she delivered her opening monologue. The audience cheered, laughed, and applauded at all the right moments, their loyalty to her evident. Clint took a sip of his water, his face unreadable. "That's her job," he said simply. "Mine's to tell the truth. Let's see what happens." Fiona launched into her routine, warming up the audience before turning her focus toward Clint. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced with mock reverence, "we've got a legend in the house tonight, a true Hollywood icon, a man who still thinks talking to an empty chair is good entertainment. Clint Eastwood." The audience erupted in laughter, some clapping, others whistling. Fiona grinned, clearly pleased with their reaction. She continued, throwing in jabs about Clint's movies, his political views, and his old-school masculinity, each punchline landing exactly as she had intended. Backstage, Jack clenched his jaw. "She's laying it on thick," he muttered. Clint, still calm, nodded slightly. "She's doing her job," he repeated. "Let her have her fun." When Fiona finally introduced Clint, the applause was mixed, some cheers, some boos. He walked onto the stage with the same quiet confidence he had carried his entire life, shaking Fiona's hand firmly before taking his seat. He tipped his hat slightly to the audience, earning a few unexpected laughs. "Mr. Eastwood," Fiona began, her voice light but with an unmistakable edge of mockery, "welcome to the show." Clint met her gaze, his expression steady. "Thanks for having me," he replied, his tone as calm as ever. "Nice crowd you've got here." The tension in the room was thick as Fiona leaned forward, her hands clasped, ready to begin the verbal sparring match. "Oh, they're great," she said smoothly. "They love a good debate." "Ready to dive in?" Clint tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering, always. And just like that, the battle began. Fiona had come prepared for a fight. Clint had come with nothing but the truth. She had an arsenal of clever lines and calculated points. He had nothing to prove. She was playing to win. He was simply playing to be himself. Neither of them knew just how much the conversation that followed would change everything. The studio buzzed with an electric anticipation as Fiona Carrington took her place behind the sleek, modern desk that served as her stage. The city skyline backdrop shimmered behind her, and the late-night spotlight logo glowed under the bright studio lights. The audience, primed and eager, leaned forward in their seats, eyes fixed on the woman they had come to see. Fiona, the queen of late-night sharp wit and cultural takedowns. She was in her element, her confidence radiating as she gripped the cue cards in front of her, though she hardly needed them. She had spent the past several days preparing for this moment, crafting lines that would strike like precision-guided missiles, jokes that would land with a mix of laughter and knowing nods from her devoted viewers. Clint Eastwood wasn't just another guest. He was a symbol of the past, a relic of Hollywood's old guard, and she was ready to dismantle him in real time. The audience roared as Fiona kicked off her monologue, her voice laced with playful mockery. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, letting the suspense build, "we have a true legend in the house tonight, a Hollywood icon, a man who has been making movies for, I don't know, longer than most of us have been alive." Laughter rippled through the crowd, and Fiona grinned, letting the joke settle before continuing. "That's right, Clint Eastwood is here. He's played cowboys, tough guys, vigilantes, basically the same role for 6 decades, but hey, why fix what isn't broken, right?" More laughter. She paused, letting the audience reaction dictate her pacing. She had mastered the rhythm of this game. Now, Clint is known for a lot of things: gritty westerns, intense stares, and of course talking to an empty chair on national television. The crowd erupted at that, clapping and cheering as Fiona leaned back in satisfaction. The infamous moment from the 2012 Republican National Convention, where Clint had spoken to an imaginary Barack Obama, was still fresh in the minds of many. Fiona knew exactly what she was doing, pressing the right buttons to set the tone of the night. Backstage, Clint Eastwood sat in the green room watching the live feed on the monitor, his expression unreadable. Jack, his assistant, paced anxiously, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "She's really going for it," Jack muttered, glancing over at Clint, who took a slow sip of water, his face calm, unmoved. "That's her job," Clint replied simply, setting the bottle down. "Let her have her fun." Jack exhaled sharply. "Yeah, but it's at your expense. You don't have to go out there, you know. You could walk away." Clint turned his gaze toward Jack, his weathered face betraying nothing but quiet certainty. "And then what?" he asked. "Let her tell my story for me?" Jack had no response. Back on stage, Fiona was wrapping up her introduction, her grin widening as she delivered the final punchline. "Please welcome the man, the myth, the very old legend, Clint Eastwood." The audience responded with a mix of cheers and scattered boos, the energy in the room shifting as Clint stepped onto the stage. He moved with the same unhurried confidence that had defined him for decades, his back straight, his movements deliberate. Dressed in a dark blazer and jeans, he looked every bit the rugged icon he had always been. He extended his hand to Fiona, who shook it with a smirk, her grip firm, her eyes locked onto his as if daring him to flinch. He didn't. Instead, he tipped his head slightly toward the audience, offering a polite, almost amused nod, earning a few unexpected chuckles from those who weren't quite sure how to read him yet. He took his seat opposite Fiona, his posture relaxed, his hands resting lightly on the armrests of the chair. Fiona leaned forward, clasping her hands together, her signature smirk still in place. "Mr. Eastwood, welcome to the show." Clint returned her gaze, his expression neutral. "Thanks for having me," he said, his voice steady, unbothered. "Nice crowd you've got here." The tension in the room was palpable. Fiona's audience was used to seeing her dominate, to watching her guests stumble under her rapid-fire quips and piercing sarcasm. But Clint wasn't fidgeting, he wasn't nervous, he wasn't reacting the way most guests did when they realized they were about to be torn apart. Fiona tilted her head slightly, studying him. "So, Clint," she began, her voice light, casual, but carrying an unmistakable edge, "you've had quite a long career, what, over 60 years now?" The audience chuckled, knowing where this was going. Clint nodded. "Something like that." Fiona leaned in slightly. "Do you ever look back and think, hey, maybe it's time to let the new generation take the reins?" The crowd laughed and applauded. Fiona grinned. It was an easy setup, an obvious dig at his age, and she expected him to deflect, maybe chuckle uncomfortably or wave it off. Instead, Clint merely tilted his head, considering her words for a beat before responding. "Well, Fiona," he said, his voice slow, deliberate, "I've always believed work isn't about age. It's about what you bring to the table. Whether you're 25 or 94, if you've got something worth saying or doing, why stop?" A few people in the audience clapped, though the reaction was quieter than before. Fiona's smile faltered just a fraction. She recovered quickly. "Sure," she said, waving a hand, "but times change, don't they? I mean, your early films, classics no doubt, but let's be honest, they're not exactly known for their progressive representation of women or minorities. Do you ever feel like maybe some of those old school values don't hold up anymore?" The crowd cheered, sensing the dig. Clint didn't flinch. He simply nodded, his face thoughtful. "I think it's important to remember," he said evenly, "that films are a reflection of their time. They capture what people were thinking, feeling, and struggling with. Sure, some things don't age well, but progress isn't about erasing the past. It's about learning from it." The audience quieted slightly, the laughter dying down as his words settled. Fiona blinked, momentarily caught off guard by his response. She wasn't done. "Fair point," she conceded, shifting gears. "But let's talk politics. You've been pretty vocal about your views over the years, and let's just say they don't exactly align with, well, a lot of this audience. Do you ever worry that being so outspoken might alienate people who used to look up to you?" Clint smiled faintly, his gaze meeting hers without hesitation. "I've always believed in being honest about who I am and what I stand for. If that means some people don't like me, so be it. Integrity isn't about being popular. It's about standing by your principles, even when it's not convenient." A murmur ran through the audience, some nodding, some skeptical. Fiona sensed the shift, her usual playbook not landing the way it normally did. Determined to keep the upper hand, she leaned in. "But don't you think that kind of stubbornness makes you out of touch?" she asked, her tone laced with mock concern. Clint chuckled softly. "You call it stubbornness. I call it staying grounded. The world moves fast, Fiona, but sometimes, in its rush to change, it forgets the value of what came before." The studio fell silent for a moment. Fiona faltered, sensing the crowd's attention shifting in a way she hadn't expected. She had come in prepared for a takedown. But Clint Eastwood wasn't playing the game the way she had planned, and for the first time she realized she might not be the one in control of this conversation. The energy in the studio had shifted. Fiona Carrington, master of the late-night takedown, had stepped into what she thought would be a straightforward exchange, a battle she was fully prepared to dominate. But Clint Eastwood wasn't giving her the reactions she expected. He wasn't flustered, defensive, or eager to prove himself. He wasn't attempting to win over the audience with witty comebacks or desperate justifications. Instead, he sat in his chair with the same quiet confidence that had defined him for decades, a presence so steady that it became unnerving. Fiona had spent her career turning conversations into performances, but Clint didn't seem to be performing at all. He was just being, and that was something she hadn't prepared for. She adjusted in her seat, shifting strategies. If he wasn't going to react to direct provocations, she would steer the conversation into deeper, more complex waters. "Let's talk about legacy," she said, tilting her head slightly. "You've had an incredible career, no one can deny that. But do you ever wonder if your legacy is, well, stuck in the past? I mean, the world is moving forward. People are reevaluating old films, old ideas, and deciding that maybe some of them weren't as great as we once thought. Do you ever feel like history is catching up with you?" The audience chuckled, sensing the trap. Clint, however, merely nodded, his expression thoughtful but unwavering. "That's an interesting way to put it," he said, his voice as steady as ever. "But here's the thing about history. It's not about looking back and deciding whether we approve of it with today's eyes. It's about understanding why things were the way they were, what people were trying to say, what they were fighting for. Progress is important, but progress without context can be dangerous. If we start tearing down everything from the past because it doesn't fit into today's narrative, we lose the ability to learn from it." The audience, who had been so eager to laugh moments before, found themselves in an unexpected silence. Clint wasn't defensive. He wasn't trying to argue or resist change. He was simply making a case for perspective, something that didn't fit neatly into Fiona's well-rehearsed format. Fiona hesitated, sensing the shift, but she wasn't ready to let go of the reins just yet. "That's a nice sentiment," she said with a small smile. "But let's be real, Clint. Some of the things we used to accept in movies and culture just weren't okay. And some people would argue that people like you, men from your era, your background, have had a harder time letting go of those outdated values." Clint exhaled softly, nodding again. "I see what you're saying," he said, his voice never wavering. "And you're right about some of it. There are things in my past and everyone's past that wouldn't hold up today. That's just the nature of time. We grow, we change. But the mistake people make is thinking that the way forward is by condemning everything that came before. That's not progress, Fiona. That's erasure. You don't move forward by burning down everything that was built before you. You move forward by learning, by building on the lessons of the past, not pretending it didn't happen." The murmurs in the audience weren't the usual kind that accompanied Fiona's sharp exchanges. They weren't the easy laughter of a crowd enjoying a spectacle. They were quieter, weightier, people shifting in their seats, reconsidering their positions. Fiona, always perceptive, recognized the change. She was losing them, and it wasn't because Clint was trying to win them over. It was because he wasn't. He wasn't playing the game she had set up. He wasn't interested in winning. He was simply telling the truth as he saw it, and the audience, despite their initial bias, was responding to it. She tapped her cue cards lightly against the desk, thinking. "Okay," she said, softening her tone just a little. "So, let's put Hollywood aside for a second. Let's talk about something bigger. Politics. You've been very vocal about your views and, well, they don't exactly align with a lot of the people in this room. Does it ever bother you, knowing that your opinions might alienate people who once admired you?" Clint met her gaze without hesitation. "If someone admires me," he said simply, "it should be for what I stand for, not for what they want me to stand for. I've never been interested in being popular, Fiona. I've been interested in being honest. If my views make some people uncomfortable, that's their right. But I'd rather be respected for standing by what I believe than liked for pretending to be something I'm not." The room was completely still. Even Fiona, who had been so quick with her jabs earlier, found herself momentarily without words. She had built her career on exposing contradictions, on making her guests confront the inconsistencies in their own logic. But Clint wasn't giving her any. He wasn't defensive, he wasn't aggressive, he was just immovable. And in his steadiness, he was turning the entire interview on its head. She licked her lips, considering her next move. "That's a noble philosophy," she said finally. "But don't you think the world does require some change, some evolution? I mean, you say you don't want to erase the past, but isn't there value in reevaluating it, in admitting that maybe some of what we once thought was good wasn't actually good?" Clint nodded. "Of course," he said. "There's always room for improvement. I've never been against change. But change should come from understanding, not from fear. The problem is, too many people today want to rewrite history because it makes them uncomfortable. But discomfort is a teacher. If something makes you uncomfortable, it means there's something to learn from it. The question we should be asking isn't how do we erase the things we don't like, but what can we take from them to make the future better?" Fiona exhaled, glancing at the crowd. She had spent the entire interview assuming they would be on her side, that they would cheer for her takedown of an old-school icon. But now they were listening to Clint. They weren't just laughing at pre-planned jokes, they were actually thinking. She had been expecting an easy fight. Instead, she had walked into something entirely different. She leaned back in her chair, staring at Clint for a long moment. He didn't fill the silence. He didn't rush to elaborate or justify himself. He simply waited. Finally, she let out a small, almost disbelieving chuckle. "You're pretty good at this," she admitted. Clint tilted his head slightly. "At what?" She gestured vaguely between them. "At making me rethink things." A small smile touched the corners of Clint's mouth. "That's the beauty of a good conversation," he said. "It's not about winning, it's about learning." And in that moment, Fiona knew she had underestimated him. This wasn't a man stuck in the past. This was a man who had lived through the past, who had seen change firsthand, and who had chosen to meet it with wisdom rather than resistance. And no matter how hard she had tried, she hadn't been able to shake him. The audience erupted into applause, not for Fiona, not for Clint, but for the conversation itself. And as the cameras continued rolling, capturing the stunned, contemplative faces in the room, it was clear that something had shifted. This wasn't just another late-night interview. This was something else entirely. Fiona Carrington had built her reputation on control, controlling the narrative, the pace, the humor, and most importantly, her guests. But as the interview with Clint Eastwood progressed, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. A loss of control. Not because Clint had wrestled it from her, not because he had engaged in a verbal battle she couldn't win, but because he had refused to fight at all. There was something about his presence, his unwavering calmness, that disarmed her in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had come into this conversation with an arsenal of wit, with carefully crafted questions designed to corner him, to make him justify himself to a modern audience. But instead of retreating into defensiveness, he had sat there, firm but unshaken, answering her pointed questions with thoughtfulness rather than deflection, responding not with the arrogance of someone who believed he had all the answers, but with the wisdom of someone who knew that the real answers weren't about proving a point, they were about understanding the bigger picture. For the first time in a long time, Fiona found herself listening not as a host looking for an angle, not as a performer trying to entertain an audience, but as a person genuinely trying to understand another. Clint wasn't like the guests she was used to. He wasn't defensive, he wasn't desperate for approval, and he certainly wasn't interested in playing to the audience. He was simply Clint, and that was enough. She had expected him to struggle under the weight of her sharp commentary, had anticipated him stumbling through justifications for his past films, his political views, his old-school masculinity. Instead, he had embraced it all without apology, not in a way that was dismissive, but in a way that forced her to see that maybe, just maybe, she had miscalculated. The audience had felt the shift too. They had come into the show expecting a spectacle, expecting Fiona to dismantle Clint the way she had so many others before him. But they weren't laughing the way they had at the beginning. They weren't cheering at her quips with the same certainty. Instead, they were watching, listening, absorbing. Even those who didn't agree with Clint couldn't deny the sheer presence of the man sitting in front of them, the undeniable weight of his words, the kind of gravitas that couldn't be faked. And in the midst of it all, Fiona felt something she hadn't expected. Respect. She leaned forward slightly, no longer trying to control the direction of the conversation, but simply trying to understand. "You've said a lot tonight about integrity," she said, her voice quieter now, less performative. "About standing by your principles, about not letting the world dictate who you should be. But don't you ever wonder if there's a cost to that? If standing by those principles sometimes means standing alone?" Clint met her gaze, his expression as steady as ever. "There's always a cost," he said simply, "but the cost of losing yourself is greater. I've seen people in this industry, in life, change who they are just to fit in, to be liked, to stay relevant, and maybe they get what they want in the short term, but in the long run, they lose something much bigger." Fiona swallowed. The words hit harder than she had expected. She had spent years crafting her public persona, carefully curating an image that people respected, feared, and admired. But was it really her? Or had she in some ways molded herself into what the world wanted her to be? She pushed the thought aside, not ready to face it yet. She glanced at the audience, at the faces that had once been so eager for a takedown, now watching with a quiet reverence. Clint had turned the tide, and he hadn't done it with force or anger. He had done it by simply being himself. And for the first time in her career, Fiona realized that maybe she had underestimated the power of that. She had built her career on being the loudest voice in the room, but Clint had proven something she hadn't expected, that sometimes quiet conviction speaks louder than any performance ever could. She exhaled softly, shaking her head with a small chuckle. "You're not what I expected, Clint," she admitted. Clint raised an eyebrow slightly, a faint, knowing smile playing at the edges of his lips. "What'd you expect?" Fiona hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I expected you to be stubborn, maybe even combative. I expected you to try to fight back, to argue, to defend yourself." She paused. "I didn't expect you to just be." Clint nodded slightly, his gaze never wavering. "That's the problem with expectations," he said. "They tell you a story before you've even heard the truth." Fiona let the words settle. She had spent years walking into conversations already convinced that she knew the ending, and maybe that was the real problem. Maybe the best conversations, the ones that actually mattered, weren't about proving a point. Maybe they were about listening. She leaned back in her chair, glancing at the clock, realizing they were nearing the end of the segment. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't in a rush to wrap things up. She wanted to sit in this moment for just a little longer. "You ever regret anything?" she asked suddenly, surprising even herself with the question. Clint was quiet for a moment before answering. "Regret's a funny thing," he said. "People think it's about wishing you'd done something different. But real regret? It's about the things you didn't do, the things you didn't say, the chances you didn't take, because you were afraid of what people might think." "I don't have a lot of regrets, Fiona. But if I do, they're the moments I let pass, because I was too caught up in the noise to recognize what really mattered." The audience was utterly silent. Even the crew members behind the cameras, usually detached from the content of the show, were watching, listening. Fiona felt something shift inside her. She didn't know what it was yet, but she knew this conversation had left a mark. She looked at Clint, at the man she had expected to be an easy target, and realized that he had given her something far more valuable than an entertaining segment. He had given her perspective, and maybe, just maybe, she would carry it with her long after the cameras stopped rolling. She smiled, this time genuinely. "Thank you, Clint," she said, "for showing up." Clint nodded, his eyes twinkling slightly. "That's all any of us can do." And as the show cut to commercial, Fiona Carrington, for the first time in her career, realized that sometimes the most powerful moments weren't the ones where you had the perfect comeback, the best joke, or the sharpest argument. Sometimes the most powerful moments were the ones where you simply listened. The interview had ended, the cameras had stopped rolling, and the audience had begun to disperse, but the impact of the conversation between Fiona Carrington and Clint Eastwood was only just beginning. What had started as an expected late-night spectacle, another sharp, entertaining takedown of an aging Hollywood legend, had turned into something no one had anticipated. Fiona herself sat at her desk in stunned silence for a few moments after Clint left the stage, watching as the crew hurried about wrapping up the show. She had been through hundreds of interviews, sparring with some of the most powerful and influential figures in entertainment, politics, and media, but this felt different. It wasn't just the way Clint had handled himself with unshakable confidence, nor was it the way he had refused to engage in a game of one-upmanship. It was the way he had spoken with such clarity, such simplicity, that even those who had come into the studio expecting to laugh at him had left with something to think about. As Fiona walked back to her dressing room, her usual post-show adrenaline was absent. Normally, after a particularly biting interview, she and her team would celebrate a job well done, reveling in the social media reactions, the trending hashtags, the think pieces that would inevitably be written about the latest guest she had skewered. But tonight, the energy was different. Veronica, her head producer, was waiting for her outside the door, her usual smirk replaced with something closer to curiosity. "That was unexpected," she said carefully, watching Fiona's reaction. Fiona let out a breath, running a hand through her hair. "Yeah," she admitted, pausing before she continued. "He didn't give me what I thought he would." Veronica nodded. "He didn't fight, he didn't get defensive, he just—" "What?" Fiona glanced at her, something unreadable in her eyes. And somehow that made him more powerful than if he had fought. Meanwhile, Clint was on his way back to his hotel, sitting in the passenger seat as Jack drove through the quiet city streets. Unlike Fiona, he wasn't caught up in post-show analysis. He had lived long enough to know that conversations like this, moments of real exchange, of genuine thought, were rare in the modern media landscape. People were so used to arguing, to proving their point, to winning the battle of perception, that they often forgot the value of simply speaking one's truth. Jack, however, was restless. "That didn't go the way she thought it would," he said, shaking his head. "You could feel it. The audience came in expecting to laugh at you, and by the end they were listening to you." Clint gave a faint smile, gazing out the window. "People listen when they hear something real," he said. "That's all I tried to do." Jack nodded, glancing at his phone as notifications began to pile up. "Well, the internet sure has a lot to say about it." And indeed it did. Within hours, clips from the interview had gone viral. But unlike Fiona's usual segments, where her sharpest jabs were cut and shared for laughs, the clips making the rounds this time were different. People weren't just talking about what Fiona had said. They were talking about how Clint had responded. His words about integrity, about learning from the past rather than erasing it, about staying true to oneself, were being dissected, discussed, and in some cases even embraced by those who hadn't expected to agree with him. On Twitter, a debate raged. Some users praised Clint's calm wisdom, saying that he had shown what true confidence and resilience looked like. Others accused him of dodging accountability, refusing to acknowledge the ways the world had changed. But regardless of which side they fell on, one thing was clear: people were talking. News outlets picked up the story, with headlines ranging from Clint Eastwood's masterclass in Grace Under Fire to Fiona Carrington faces unexpected challenge from Hollywood legend. Think pieces flooded the internet, with journalists and commentators analyzing the unexpected power dynamic of the interview. Late-night television had long been a battleground where older, more traditional figures were skewered by younger, progressive hosts. But this time, the formula hadn't played out as expected. Clint hadn't resisted change, he had simply questioned the way it was being framed. And for many, that resonated in a way no one had anticipated. Fiona, sitting in her apartment later that night, scrolled through the responses, her expression unreadable. Normally, she thrived on post-show analysis, reveling in the ways her words were being dissected, debated, and praised. But tonight, she wasn't feeling victorious. She was feeling reflective. She clicked on a clip from the interview, one where Clint had spoken about regret, about the dangers of getting caught up in the noise, about how real mistakes weren't the things you did, but the chances you let pass. She had been so focused on being right for so long, on making sure she was always the smartest, the quickest, the most prepared person in the room, that she hadn't stopped to ask herself if she was actually listening, not just to her guests, but to herself. She wasn't the only one affected. Across the country, in workplaces, classrooms, and homes, people were discussing the interview in ways Fiona hadn't anticipated. A high school teacher in Ohio played a clip for her students, sparking a debate about cancel culture, historical revisionism, and the nature of progress. A journalist in New York wrote a column about how true confidence wasn't about volume, but about the ability to stand firm without needing validation. A young filmmaker in Los Angeles tweeted that watching Clint had reminded him that being true to his voice mattered more than chasing trends. At her next production meeting, Fiona sat at the head of the table, her team waiting for her usual rundown of the night's topics. But instead of launching into her agenda, she took a moment. "I've been thinking a lot about last night," she said, her voice measured, "about that conversation with Clint." Her team exchanged glances, unsure of where she was going. "For years we've built this show around a certain kind of exchange," she continued. "A certain energy, a certain expectation of how these interviews will go. But what if we tried something different?" Veronica frowned. "You're not saying we stop challenging people, are you?" Fiona shook her head. "No, but I am saying that maybe sometimes, instead of trying to win, we should just listen." The room was silent for a moment before someone finally spoke. "That's different," one of the junior writers murmured. Fiona nodded. "Yeah," she said, "and maybe that's not a bad thing." For Clint, life moved on as usual. He returned to his ranch, back to the quiet, back to the simplicity he had always valued. He didn't track the media response, didn't engage in the online debates, didn't issue statements. He had said what he needed to say, and that was enough. But somewhere out there, in a world filled with noise, there were people who had heard him. People who had paused, even just for a moment, to consider what it meant to truly stand by one's principles. And maybe, just maybe, That was the real impact of the interview. Not in the headlines, not in the social media debates, but in the quiet moments when people stopped, reflected, and realized that sometimes the most powerful voices aren't the ones shouting the loudest. The days following Clint Eastwood's interview on the late-night spotlight were filled with endless debates, think pieces, and social media discussions. Some praised his calm, unwavering demeanor, calling it a masterclass in integrity. Others dissected Fiona Carrington's approach, questioning whether her signature sharp wit had met its match in Clint's quiet, deliberate wisdom. But beyond the media frenzy, beyond the headlines and the viral clips, something deeper had taken root in those who had watched the exchange unfold. It wasn't about who had won the interview. It wasn't about victory at all. It was about something more profound, something increasingly rare in today's world: the power of standing firm in one's beliefs without the need to prove anything to anyone. Clint Eastwood had walked into that interview not to argue, not to defend, and not to attack. He had shown up simply as himself, with no agenda other than to speak the truth as he saw it. And that, more than anything, was what had resonated with so many. People were used to watching debates that turned into shouting matches, discussions that devolved into performances where participants spoke not to communicate, but to dominate. But Clint had done the opposite. He had listened. He had responded with thoughtfulness, not aggression. He had allowed Fiona to fire off her jokes, her criticisms, her pointed questions, without ever flinching, without ever needing to match her energy. And in doing so, he had done something far more powerful. He had made people stop and think. For Fiona, the realization of what had transpired came in waves. She had entered that interview with the intention of challenging Clint, of forcing him to confront his past, to justify himself in the face of a progressive audience that saw him as outdated. But he hadn't taken the bait. Instead, he had answered every question with a measured confidence, never once wavering in who he was. And what was more, he had done it without arrogance, without hostility. It had disarmed her in a way she hadn't expected. She had built a career out of pressing people, of forcing them into uncomfortable spaces where they either fought back or crumbled under pressure. But Clint had done neither. He had simply been. And as much as she hated to admit it, that had shaken something in her. Because in a world where everyone was trying to be the loudest, he had proven that real power came from knowing when to speak and when to let silence do the work. In the weeks that followed, Fiona found herself re-watching moments from the interview, hearing Clint's words in ways she hadn't fully absorbed in the moment. She thought about his statement on integrity, how real integrity wasn't about being liked, but about being true to oneself, even when it wasn't convenient. She thought about his views on history, on how progress should be about learning rather than erasing. She had spent so much time believing that the only way forward was through dismantling the past, through tearing down outdated ways of thinking. But Clint had offered a different perspective, one that she hadn't been ready for in the moment. Progress, he had said, wasn't about abandoning what came before. It was about understanding it, taking the lessons, and building something stronger. And as she reflected on her own career, on the way she had approached conversations, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she had been too focused on proving her point to ever truly listen to the other side. Beyond Fiona's own introspection, the interview had sparked conversations across the country. It wasn't just another viral moment, another late-night segment that people would forget in a week. It had lingered. It had made people question the way they engaged with those they disagreed with. A young college student who had grown up admiring Fiona's sharp takedowns found herself wondering if she had been too quick to dismiss those she didn't see eye to eye with. A retired veteran in Texas who had long felt like his values were under siege in an ever-changing world found comfort in Clint's words about staying true to what mattered. A journalist in New York wrote a column about how the interview had reminded him of the lost art of conversation, of speaking to understand rather than to conquer. Clint, for his part, had moved on. He had never been one to dwell on moments like this, never been one to chase the approval of the public. He had lived long enough to know that the noise would fade, that the world would move on to its next debate, its next controversy. But what mattered to him wasn't the headlines or the social media buzz. It was the fact that for one night, in a room filled with expectations of conflict, he had been able to share something real. He had spoken his truth, and whether people agreed or not, he had done so without fear, without performance. Fiona, however, couldn't move on so easily. The interview had left an imprint on her in a way she hadn't expected. She found herself questioning not just how she had handled that conversation, but how she had handled all of her conversations. Had she been truly listening, or had she simply been waiting for her turn to speak? Had she been engaging with her guests with the intention of learning, or had she been engaging with the intention of proving them wrong? These questions unsettled her because they forced her to confront the possibility that she had been so focused on winning debates that she had missed the opportunity for real dialogue. One evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, scrolling through clips of the interview yet again, she made a decision. She opened her laptop, started a new document, and began to type. "Last night's conversation with Clint Eastwood reminded me of something important," she wrote. "We spend so much time trying to prove we're right that we forget to ask whether we're truly listening. Clint didn't argue. He didn't try to win. He just spoke. And maybe, just maybe, we could all learn something from that." She hesitated for a moment, then hit publish. The post went viral almost instantly. People responded with their own reflections, sharing how the interview had made them think differently, how it had challenged them to consider perspectives they might have otherwise dismissed. And for the first time in her career, Fiona felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not triumph, not validation, but something deeper. Growth. The conversation that night between Clint and Fiona wasn't just an interview. It wasn't just another late-night moment. It was a reminder that in a world filled with noise, with arguments, with people scrambling to be heard, there was still power in quiet strength. There was still power in standing firm without shouting, in speaking truth without demanding agreement, in having the kind of integrity that didn't waver based on the opinions of others. Because at the end of the day, the most important voices aren't the loudest ones. They're the ones that leave an echo long after they've gone silent. In life, as we grow older, we accumulate wisdom through experience, but we also carry assumptions, beliefs we've held for years, ideas shaped by the world we once knew. Yet, the world is always changing, and sometimes we find ourselves in conversations that challenge us, forcing us to reconsider not just what we believe, but how we engage with those who see the world differently. The conversation between Clint Eastwood and Fiona Carrington wasn't just a late-night interview. It was a reflection of something deeper, something that resonates with anyone who has ever stood firm in their values while navigating a world that doesn't always align with them. It was a lesson in the power of quiet strength, in the importance of listening, and in the realization that integrity is not about being right all the time, but about being true to oneself, even when the world pushes back. For those who have lived long enough to see the tides of history shift, it can be frustrating to witness rapid change. Traditions that once seemed unshakable are now questioned. Values that were once widely accepted are now debated. And the role of elders, once revered for their wisdom, is often challenged by a younger generation eager to forge their own path. It is easy in these moments to feel dismissed, to feel as though the world no longer has space for the lessons we have learned over a lifetime. But Clint's approach in that interview serves as a reminder that wisdom does not need to be shouted to be heard. It does not need to be forced upon others. Instead, it carries the most power when it is delivered with patience, humility, and a willingness to engage in meaningful conversations rather than battles of ego. One of the most profound lessons from Clint's conversation was his emphasis on history, not as something to be erased, but as something to be learned from. Many older individuals feel a disconnect from the modern world because the past they live through is often criticized or rewritten in ways that don't align with their own experiences. It can be disheartening to hear that values once respected are now seen as outdated, that ways of thinking that once shaped society are now under scrutiny. However, Clint's words remind us that progress does not mean abandoning the past. It means building upon it, recognizing both the good and the bad, and carrying forward the lessons that still hold value. We cannot teach future generations if we only react defensively. We must be willing to share our experiences with openness, allowing others to learn rather than feeling the need to prove ourselves. Another critical takeaway from Clint's approach was his ability to remain calm in the face of criticism. Too often, discussions today feel like competitions. Who can talk the loudest? Who can prove the other wrong? Who can walk away feeling victorious? But in reality, no one truly wins when conversations become arguments. Instead, Clint demonstrated the power of speaking with conviction, without hostility. When Fiona pushed him, he didn't push back with aggression. He didn't try to defeat her with clever words or defensive justifications. He simply answered with the truth as he saw it, without apology, but also without arrogance. This is a skill that many of us can apply in our own lives, especially in conversations with younger generations who may challenge our perspectives. It is natural to want to defend what we know, to feel the need to correct misconceptions, or fight against what we perceive as unfair judgments. But true wisdom lies in knowing that sometimes the best way to be heard is to listen first. To engage in a way that invites understanding rather than conflict. Perhaps one of the most universal lessons from the interview is the idea that integrity is not about seeking approval. It is about standing by one's principles. As we age, we often reflect on the choices we've made, the paths we've taken, and the moments where we either stood firm or wavered under pressure. Clint's words about regret were particularly impactful, not as a longing for different outcomes, but as an acknowledgement that true regret often comes from the times we stayed silent when we should have spoken, the moments we let pass because we feared what others might think. This is a reminder that it is never too late to live with integrity, to hold on to the values that define us, and to ensure that our voices, when they do speak, do so with meaning. For older individuals, this lesson holds even greater significance. Many of us have spent years conforming to expectations, whether in our careers, in our families, or in society. We have learned when to speak and when to hold our tongues, when to fight and when to let things go. But as we reach a certain stage in life, we realize that the opinions of others matter far less than the peace we have with ourselves. Clint's interview showed that true contentment comes from knowing who you are and refusing to compromise that identity for the sake of approval. This is a powerful message for anyone who has ever felt pressure to change in order to fit into a world that no longer feels familiar. At the same time, the conversation between Clint and Fiona also reminds us that integrity is not about stubbornness. It is not about refusing to evolve or rejecting all change simply because it is different. Rather, it is about discerning which values are worth holding on to and which perspectives are worth reconsidering. Growth does not mean abandoning who we are, but it does mean staying open to new ideas, to listening even when we disagree, to engaging in discussions that challenge us rather than shutting them down. In the end, what made Clint's interview so impactful was not that he won against Fiona, nor was it that he changed her mind entirely. It was that he left an impression, not just on her, but on the audience, on those who watched, and found themselves reflecting on their own conversations, their own ways of engaging with the world. He reminded us that wisdom is not about forcing others to agree with us, but about offering our perspectives in a way that invites reflection. As we move forward in life, facing new challenges, new conversations, and new generations with different ways of thinking, we can take Clint's approach as a guide. We do not need to prove ourselves. We do not need to fight for validation. What we need to do is remain steady in who we are, share our stories with honesty, and trust that the right lessons will endure, not because we demanded it, but because they are worth remembering. And in that, we find the quiet strength of integrity, the kind that doesn't shout to be heard, but speaks in a way that lingers long after the conversation has ended.